My name is Gabriel Melendez, Director of the Center for Regional Studies at the University of New Mexico. I would like to welcome you all to one of our programs in the La Canoa Legacy Series, a partnership between the National Hispanic Cultural Center and the Center for Regional Studies. The Center for Regional Studies is dedicated to the creation and dissemination of knowledge about New Mexico, the Greater Southwest as a region, and its connections to northern Mexico, Latin America, and the Iberian Peninsula. The La Canoa Legacy Series takes its inspiration from the word canoa. A canoa is a sloop-rigged fishing boat, common in the Amazon, but in New Mexico it is the name of some common everyday tools, a simple canal or flute, or the wooden paddle a baker uses to move loaves of bread in and out of a hot oven. Always La Canoa receives and transports people and resources. And we want these talks to transport us and move the conversation between presenters and audience members back and forth in rich dialogue. We also want our talks to bring practical, useful information to community members, researchers, and others interested in the history, culture, politics, sociology, and religious experiences of our region.
I really like kind of a dialogue kind of presentations, mixing it up. So I'll limit my presentation to about 20 minutes. And then I'm going to invite my graduate students who've been a full part of this team since the beginning to give their perspectives. And then I'd like to open the floor for you to engage questions with us. Any questions about the video that we've been scrolling. We have some of the vintage photos. We have images from the various workshops we conducted down in southern New Mexico. So if you have any questions about any of those, you can raise those during the Q&A. I love this space. What a beautiful space, an archival space. I love being around the books. I love the stories that are just surrounding us in this beautiful building. So, and most of all, thank you so much for being here. So, in the tradition of academic presentations and lectures, I'll give you my official kind of formal title to this paper, and it kind of encapsulates all the different themes that we'll be weaving throughout our lecture today. Embodied Rhetoric and the Women of Local 890, the Cold War Mexican-American Labor Rights Movement, Empire Zinc Strike, and Mining Salt of the Earth. Sometime during the summer, as the women were picketing, the district attorney, Thomas Foy, gave the sheriff and some deputies permission to break the women's picket line. We didn't anticipate the violence that would come. As I was going around the circle, one of the cars that a deputy was driving caught me by surprise. As it was moving fast, the only thing I could do was hold on to the hood of the car the best way I could. I was able to hold on for about 50 feet. And at that time, I knew I was either going to go under the car or I had to throw myself to the side of the road. As I lay on the ground, I could see some women coming to get me. I could see that a car had completely run over Mrs. Consuelo Martinez, an elderly lady of about 75 at the time. The women dragged me back to the side of the road, and deputies started to arrest us. Some of the men who'd been watching dragged Mrs. Martinez to the side of the road so they wouldn't run over her again. One of the men was shot on the leg because he was trying to help us. One of the deputies threw me back in his car and he took me to the Watts Clinic in Silver City. I had a dislocated shoulder. They took care of it at the clinic and then released me. The deputy then drove me to the courthouse and into the jail. The jail cell where they put me was so very overcrowded, the women moved the children and the teenagers to the front of the cell, which had slats, so they could breathe better. An elderly lady named Bersabe Rosales was placed on a bed because she was 90 years old at the time and was passing out. My dad heard about the violence in Hanover at his job at Kennecott in Santa Rita through the radio. He knew that I was supposed to be there and left his job to go to the courthouse to see what was going on. He did not know that I was hurt and was hoping I was not jailed. They let us out after many complaints from the community, who became outraged about having women and children in jail because we'd already spent 3 to 4 hours in a crowded jail cell. My father had to sign release papers and was given a court date, and everybody was released. The strike ended with the violence and the jailing of union officials and the women and the children. I can still see the jail cell from the street to this day, because it's at the center of the courthouse, and I can see the window to the cell where we were. This is the voice of Rachel Valencia. Her Salt of the Earth story began in 1950. The story for me begins some 50 years later as a scholar in October of 2002 in Corpus Christi, Texas, with the premiere of the PBS documentary, Justice for My People, the Hector P. Garcia story. I was a freshly minted PhD at the time when I first met Vicente Ximenes, and I was immediately struck by Vicente's candor, his charisma, and his insights. And we launched a dialogue that would last for more than a decade. Boxes of papers began arriving at my office at Texas A&M soon after our first meeting. When I commented that I was beginning to think that my next book would be about him, he quipped, "I was wondering when you would figure that out." Although Vicente was a sixth-generation Tejano, New Mexico was his beloved adopted home for more than 50 years. And by some twist of fate, I would accept a faculty position at the University of New Mexico in January of 2004. The journey researching and writing about Vicente Ximenes and his compadre, Hector Garcia, two key leaders of the Cold War Mexican-American civil rights movement, would ultimately lead me to Baird, New Mexico, the home of the historic Local 890 Union Hall. Quick water break. Fast forward 10 years to October 2014, 8 months after Vicente's death. I read the stirring news in the Albuquerque Journal that the iconic Local 890 voted to decertify the Union after more than 75 years. My curiosity and my concern was piqued. I was finishing writing the Ximenes book, and it became clear that I needed to explore more deeply how the epic Empire Zinc mine strike of the early 1950s had shaped Vicente's rhetorical imagination and inspired his work as a community organizer and founder of the first chapter of the American GI Forum at Albuquerque in 1950. So in April 2016, I found myself driving over the Gila Mountains to meet with the leaders of the Local 9424 of the United Steelworkers Union and to discuss the decertification of Local 890 and see the decommissioned Union Hall in Baird, New Mexico. I started asking questions of local historians, scholars, leaders, public officials about the women of Local 890 who had held that picket line. The silence was deafening. Over the next 6 months, it became clear that this project was more than academic for me. I was searching for hope in the face of overwhelming despair at the turbulent outcome of the 2016 presidential election and the loss of a nation's soul. So this lecture then focuses on this parallel journey of launching the Salt of the Earth Recovery Project in 2018 to explore the moral courage of the Mexicana leaders like Rachel Valencia, who changed the rhetorical imagination of Cold War America. The Local 890 chapter of the International Union of Mine, Mill, and Smelter Workers of Hanover, New Mexico, comprised of 1,400 members of predominantly Mexican-American and Mexican-origin laborers, staged one of the nation's most effective and groundbreaking strikes, extending 15 months from October 1950 to January 1952. The erosion of ancestral communities into company towns, as illustrated in this landmark case, provided a catalyst for political activism. The grievances of the Empire Zinc workers included racial discrimination in job duties and pay, toxic work environments, no strike clauses, and inequitable power sharing between labor and management. The dramatic showdown between the women and the local law enforcement agents, and the resulting incarceration of 45 women, 17 children, and a 6-month-old baby shocked audiences locally and nationally. Women took a leading role in the Empire Zinc mine strike to confront enduring harassment, intimidation, incarceration, and numerous civil rights violations by the dominant Anglo political structure. The legacy of loss and suffering of the workers of Local 890 still resonates in this small mining community. The gaping hole in the landscape outside this quaint and nostalgic Old West town near Silver City is a startling reminder of the tremendous cost, human as well as environmental, of the multinational copper mining industry on the high desert landscape of New Mexico. The job action of the women and the men of Local 890 captured such national attention that independent filmmakers Paul and Sylvia Jericho were inspired to make a film based on the incident, The Salt of the Earth. This lecture then aligns the story of the women of Local 890 with the journey of conceptualizing and implementing the Salt of the Earth Recovery Project with a team of graduate students in the spring of 2018. Through the construction of community writing workshops and the development of the Salt of the Earth Digital Cuentos Archive, which you're seeing here today, scrolling, our team engaged with local citizens, activists, scholars in a deliberative process toward a collective vision for the preservation and restoration of this historic Union Hall in Baird. Finally, I extend this story to include reflections on the work of mentoring new leaders into this restorative space of community activism and writing. Working and living together in the space that I can best describe as the deliberative democratic tension, that intimate public space between strength and vulnerability, represents, in my experience, the soul of Mexicana leadership embodied by the women of Local 890. From January to June 2018, Zachary, Stephen, and Kelly and I conceptualized the Digital Cuentos Community Writing Workshop together with leaders of Baird, Silver City, and the United Steelworkers Union, Local 9424, in Las Cruces. Our ultimate goal was to construct a public archive of testimonials of community members, and a generous research grant from the UNM Center for Regional Studies provided support for travel and materials for the Digital Cuentos writing workshops. In July of 2018, during one of our workshops, sitting in the garden in this courtyard behind the Silver City Museum, my team and I were busy working with local community members when a law enforcement officer in a bulletproof vest strode through the area. She made eye contact with me as she walked by, but she didn't speak. She walked directly to the museum curator, who was chatting with community writing workshop participants, and asked if he had seen a person of interest running through the area. The officer spoke to no one else. And I began to wonder, and it puzzled me, why would an officer giving chase not speak to everyone in the area or investigate the site more thoroughly? Not even peek around the corner or peer down the street. Without further conversation, what seems to have been a code word exchanged between them, the officer turned around and left the community writing workshop as intently as she had arrived. Were the local Silver City authorities expecting a Charlotte's-like style protest with these community writing workshops? The Silver City Museum curator had confided in me that the public announcement of the museum sponsorship of the Salt of the Earth Recovery Project had been contested by several Silver City detractors. What the young female officer found, though, on that Saturday morning in July, was a gathering of citizens scattered about this vivid green grass, telling their stories to one another. The son of the first Mexican-American sheriff in Grant County, sitting in a wheelchair, scrolling through the Digital Cuentos archive. Two young Baird natives, a young Chicano UNM college student and his Chicano New Mexico State girlfriend, writing together. Our presence was radical. It was bold, it was subversive, transgressive as any protest. We were engaging together in the practice of deliberative democracy. And this, I believe, is embodied rhetoric. It was my principal goal as chair of the Salt of the Earth Recovery Project to cultivate the conditions, the rhetorical situation for democratic deliberative practice, and to construct a platform, a safe space for community members to exercise their own voices. I'd hoped to enact what the Greeks, the architects of ancient democracy, called the agora, where citizens could engage with each other in the messy work of citizenship, to tell their stories, to advance their own positions, and together determine the fate of the now empty Local 890 Union Hall. Moreover, as an academic researcher and public intellectual who is engaged in that slow research of scholarly inquiry, I was determined to keep the findings of my research free, open, and accessible, and not buried in the annals of history or bogged down in the lengthy, mystified, and protracted process of scholarly publication. Someday, perhaps there will be a book about this journey, but more importantly, it was imperative to me to keep the Salt of the Earth Recovery Project current, relevant, transparent, and inclusive, and not locked away in the ivory towers of the Academy. Above all else, the stories and the murals and the artifacts and the archival materials needed to remain the intellectual property of the community themselves. Hence, my team and I painstakingly imagined and designed the Salt of the Earth Digital Cuentos writing workshops as both an organic and a digital archive, using old school pencil and papers and new school digital modalities, generating workshop materials in both English and in Spanish, and you have the handouts that we actually use to promote the event with you, and the URL to the Digital Cuentos is on those handouts for you, so you can consult it in your own space and time. Because of the Salt of the Earth project was a team effort from the onset, I'm going to limit my remarks just to these 20 minutes and ask then Stephen Romero, Zachary Munoz, and Kelly Likey Martin to step out and speak out about our process and their own findings with you as well. More than 65 years after the Empire Zinc mine strike, I am inspired by the moral courage of leaders of the Local 890 and their descendants in Baird, who are keeping the story alive. The story continues to reach across generation, class, race, gender, and national boundaries. The power of acts of moral courage like the Empire Zinc mine strike extend into our collective consciousness to stir our souls when we need them most. Carencia, the love and reverence for family and home and place and community and landscape, resonates as an organizing theme in these stories of the 1950s Empire mine strike. And after more than 6 decades, those stories ripple across time in the sights and the images and the narratives surrounding the preservation and the protection of the Local 890 Union Hall, especially the public art of the murals painted by the local artists and youth. And after more than 2 decades and writing 2 books on Cold War Mexican-American civil rights movement, I maintain that the Empire Zinc mine strike in Hanover represents el alma of the World War II Mexican-American civil rights movement and el corazón of the Chicano movement that followed a decade later. The Local 890 Union Hall is one of the few landmark sites of this important historical period. Hence, the impetus in 2018 to restore and preserve the Local 890 Union Hall is so closely linked across generations. When I began studying Cold War era civil rights movements during the summer of 1998 as a doctoral candidate, I made a pilgrimage to the key landmarks of African American civil rights movement, Birmingham, Memphis. I was beginning my research on Mexican American post-World War II veterans' rights activist Dr. Garcia, who established the American GI Forum in Corpus Christi in 1948, which happened only 2 years before the Empire Zinc mine strike. But what I discovered in 1998 was there were few, if any, national monuments at that time celebrating the public memory of Mexican American activists. And certainly nowhere could I find monuments commemorating Mexicana or Chicana leaders. The Cesar Chavez National Monument in California was not even established until 2012. So I immediately felt inspired by the Empire Zinc mine strike story when I saw the film Salt of the Earth. I just joined the faculty at UNM. I was teaching a course in Mexican American civil rights and saw the film for the first time. But I didn't feel both a professional and a civic responsibility to help protect that Union Hall until I saw the luminous story of collective sacrifice in the vibrant murals painted inside and outside the Union Hall. I think in that search for hope amidst the despair at the collapse of our national vision for universal liberty, for justice and inclusivity, I felt that vision was being compromised, if not at risk of being lost, if the Union Hall had been demolished or lost. The urgency to recover those narratives and the murals and artifacts related to Local 890 become even more evident when I visited the bridge where the strike actually happened. A bridge, a place relegated to obscurity, covered in weeds and litter and graffiti, and is not listed on any tour guide anywhere in the region. Only by asking local librarians, historians, was able to find this hidden bridge. As Paul Ricoeur argues in Memory, History, and Forgetting, everything starts not from the archives, but from testimony. We lose our national stories, like our familial narratives, one frayed strand at a time, until the fabric of collective identity is unraveled, and no one is left to weave themselves into the story or witness how the intricate tapestry of belonging is woven and maintained. And since the Local 890 Union Hall was first established in Baird soon after World War II, this was an old Army barracks, dragged over the mountains from Deming and placed in Baird, and became the home for the Union Local 890. It has been the center of the social life of the Central Mining District. For 70 years, it was a site of union meetings, lady auxiliary events, wedding reception, baptism and graduation celebrations, and quinceañeras. The Local 890 Union Hall embodied the cultural and social values of that community across generations, a crucible of carencia. The Cold War civil rights era and labor rights movement that was catalyzed in Baird and Hanover in the early 50s vibrated concurrently across the nation and across social groups. Chicano activists like Jorge Gonzalez, Cesar Chavez, as well as Chicana leaders like Dolores Huerta and Gloria Anzaldúa came of age in that Cold War era. And the soul of the United States began shifting like some collective dance when the women of Local 890 took to the picket lines and stood firm for la huelga, la comunidad, la solidaridad y la dignidad. Although the environmental and labor issues of South Texas in 1948 and southern New Mexico in 1950 were very different, the struggle for equitable work, sustainable living conditions, and healthy communities were common themes for Cold War Mexican-American activists. And while South Texas relied on an agricultural economy, southern New Mexico relied on a mining industry. The Greek word oikos, which roughly translates to the word home, is the root term for both words economy and ecology. These circles of relationships rest at the center of home and community and work. The landscape of Grant County, nestled in the Gila Mountains of southern New Mexico, tells its own story of the long mining history of the region spanning centuries. And the Santa Rita mountain range surrounding the central mining district of Baird and Hanover shows the patina of time, like the antepasados who have labored here for generations. This is the story that needs to be remembered and must be preserved with this historic Union Hall. And this is the reason for launching the Salt of the Earth Recovery Project. I believe that the leadership demonstrated by the women of the Empire Zinc mine strike represents one of the most compelling and inspiring moments of civic activism in U.S. history. The legacy and sacrifice of these leaders remain inscribed in the murals and the paintings of the local 890 Union Hall. These are the testimonials, the resonances breaking the silence, and this is the very purpose of the Salt of the Earth Recovery Project, to celebrate the lives and the labor and the leadership of the women and the men of Local 890. I'd like to turn the floor over now to Zachary.
My name is Zachary Munoz. I'm a graduate student at the University of New Mexico. I was also had the benefit and real blessing to work with Hall Kells and my colleagues Stephen and Kelly to be project coordinators on this project. I want to start with a quote from Isaiah Solis, a student at the University of New Mexico and a local in Baird. He mentions in his archive testimonial, "This whole thing, the strike and its impact was bigger than I thought. My Spanish teacher in middle school wanted to show us that our town, Baird, has a history that is worth exploring. I think she just wanted to show us that the Union Hall could still be something if it's cared for. When I was young, it was just a building. But now I guess it's made my little town of Baird seem a lot bigger." The Salt of the Earth Recovery Project's mission, our project's mission, was to honor the stories of the women and the men of the Local 890 chapter, supporting the restoration and preservation of the hall, and the public memory and the bravery demonstrated by the women who took up the strike line after the men were forced off. When we went to Baird and Grant County, we were only there to listen, and we created a public space to listen. It was really important to our project that we go to the center place, or the agora, as Michelle said. So we set up at libraries and museums. Navigating this contentious space required delicacy in forming interpersonal relationships with the community. We created a space for the community to use in any way that they wanted. Sometimes it even required strange last-minute trips to Walmart to get HDMI cords. The community responded well to our presence, as evidenced in the online archive that was produced by the community and by the civic scholars in the community. The role of archives in our lives as scholars and citizens is invaluable. It's a place where stories lay dormant for eager hands. Constructions of archives are often curated. The materials are bid on. They're often under lock and key, unavailable to public. Sometimes they are in someone's closet or someone's house just because they thought it was fascinating to own a piece of history from someone that has passed away. But the archive created by the community surrounding the Salt of the Earth Recovery Project is a lot different. It honors the women, their actions, and their voices in a way that only surviving community can. People from all over the community came out to write and publish their stories, sharing how they value the women who striked. Sitting in the building with the community showed me the profound influence the women played in everyone's lives. To quote Willie Andazola, he was a gentleman who was not only in the strike as a kid, but he was also in the film. His face is pretty prominent. He does this in the bars. He says, "The ladies took care of me. Now a lot of them are past. I remember thinking about my mom being arrested. I remember the men couldn't strike, so that's why the women were out there." The archive exists in the public sphere that is not only available to the immediate community that created it, but also available to the rest of the world. Anyone can view these stories and learn the significant role the women played, and learn how much respect the surviving community has for these women. The women are substantiated in the public memory of the surviving community, and the archive that they've created permeates this memory. I would like to turn the floor over to my colleague and dear friend, Kelly Likey.
So as Zach mentioned, my name is Kelly Likey, and I feel extraordinarily blessed to have the opportunity to work on this project and get to know the community members of the Central Mining District. I was one of the project managers for the recovery project. And as I began to learn more about the cuentos of the strike and the union, I became invested in learning more about the process of preserving and designating the Union Hall as a rhetorical act of making memory. As Michelle pointed out, the Empire Zinc mine strikes set a precedent for fighting political and social injustices. And as a woman in the workforce myself, I know that it's the kind of narrative we need to instill pride and empowerment into current social climates. I want to read to you what Local 890 member Felix Jaramillo said in his Anecdota. The significance of these historical events are of great importance to continuing the struggle for labor rights, women's rights, and equal pay for both genders in the workplace. He said, "The struggle still continues, and the fight is not over." We need to memorialize these stories and stories like this as stories of courage. In January 2017, we went to meet with the United Steelworkers Union leaders in Las Cruces to talk about the future of the Union Hall. We found that the community had already been using the building as a gathering space. The president of the union, Richard Madrid, told us that he learned, despite the lack of electricity, the lack of running water, citizens of Bayard were using it anyway, for quinceañeras, family reunions, and even a place for weekly band practice. So even though the United Steelworkers Union held the official keys to the building, the hall was already culturally significant in that space, unofficially designated by the copying of an unknown amount of keys. He had no idea how many were in existence. So the union locked the doors for liability purposes, not only because they wanted to close off the community, not because they wanted to close off the community to their gathering space, but then they came to ask us for help to memorialize the space, help them register the property as a historic site, get an official designation for something already unofficially designated. The process of historic designation in the state of New Mexico is set in legislation, and it's outlined on the website of the Department of Cultural Affairs. What I learned in looking through this is that New Mexico has more than 1,200 cultural properties protected as state historic sites, but only 6 are state historic monuments. These are sites that have the support to provide interpretation as well as the traffic to bring in money and sustain themselves. The problem with new historic properties is that each addition to the list spreads state funding thinner. Another strange thing we encountered with the Union Hall is that a group in Las Cruces called Juntos en la Unión had already applied for historic designation of the Union Hall. On February 3rd, 2017, just 1 month before we met with the leaders of the United Steelworkers Union, the House Memorial 22 Act officially passed and designated the Union Hall as a state cultural property based on, first, its political significance and history, because the building's representation of minority groups struggle over triumph and injustice and discrimination that the Local 890 pursuit of happiness guaranteed under the United States Constitution during and after the 1950 to 1951 Empire strikes. Second, the local community significance of the building as a center where miners and their families could attend lectures and movies and socialize at dances, bingo parties, weddings, baptisms, in addition to being used for local business. Third, because of the social significance of the film as one of the first motion pictures to advance feminism and the social political view. The novelty of the significance of the film as the only motion picture ever blacklisted in American film history. And the cultural significance of the Library of Congress's designation as one of the top 100 most culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant films. We found it interesting that 3 out of 5 of these had really not much to do with the building itself at all. Willie Andalzoa, one of the children jailed in a separate city from his mother during the strikes, the one that Zach also quoted, says in his Recollection, "We need to honor my mom and the women and the children that were involved. They deserve all of the recognition, and it's overdue." With the unofficial and official designation, the question remained, why didn't we, the community, know about this historic site? Now it is one of more than 1,200 historic sites that so few people know about. It was already a memory space covered with murals that describe what the building means to the community, and the historic designation validates its place in history. However, this history is only as valid as the knowledge that it generates through stories. That's why we strove to revive the stories of the Empire Zinc mine strikes and a personal connection to the building. We wanted to collaborate with the community, tie history down and entwine it with memory, so we not only marked their history in space, we were writing it. I'm going to pass the stage off to Stephen.
My name is Stephen Romero. It's been an honor and a privilege to see this project through, to help organize and consult on a variety of things over the past year. The one thing that I want to focus on, or the one thing that I've really learned throughout this entire process, is how much trust we have to put in to sustain relationships with one another. There was so much about entering into this community space and these public and private spaces and the ways in which people would tell us stories, people who had never met us before. And there was a kind of vulnerability in that, that mirrored personal experience that I'd been going through for the past year. So I'm going to read this through, knowing that the biggest thing that I got from this project for all of us was to establish a kind of trust. My mom passed away this past August, and one of my mom's wishes before she died was to write her life story. Unfortunately, she was too ill towards the end of her life to do this for herself. I mention this here because over the course of the year I worked on this project, I got to know my mom in ways I never had before. At the same time, I spent time visiting with folks in Baird and Silver City, listening to stories about fierce women who not only raised families but also fought for their survival, about the local 890 Union Hall where families and friends would congregate to sing and dance. During my mom's last years, she also sang and danced and opened herself up to people outside her immediate family. Understanding this, I know it's absolutely essential to develop trust with and among one's community if they are to sustain relationships. Over the past year, I would say we've all learned the value as well as the limitations of this process in building and sustaining trust. I suspect there is a vulnerability that comes with sitting down with strangers to tell intimate stories about their loved ones and life experiences. What's more, that these stories will be available for public consumption. Yet each person we sat with were eager to tell their story. This in and of itself reveals to me a kind of trust that I admire. More often than not, the lives and narratives of poor and working class women are omitted or lost from historical memory. And what's become clear to me from working on this project is how important it is to find pathways for preserving these narratives. For instance, our writing workshops provided an opportunity to place these narratives in conversation with one another. And the end product, the Salt of the Earth Recovery Project blog, linked these conversations to a broader cultural ethos or spirit. On the blog's homepage, one can trace a trajectory of generations of people all to the stories of the Empire Zinc mine strike, the 890 Union Hall, and even the film, The Salt of the Earth. Through this digital space, the community has generated an open source document that both captures the querencia, that deep connection to place, of a living history that continues to permeate across the Baird and Silver City communities, and functions as a teaching instrument for educators and communities both within and outside the region. If my mom had the opportunity to talk with me over huevos rancheros and steak and eggs, as we often did on Sunday mornings, about what came of this project, how all the time, work, and trust placed across communities resulted in the sustainability of historical memory, particularly those women who fought fiercely for their family's survival, she would have felt encouraged and hopeful that her story would be told in some form and preserved someday. Thank you.
So we'd like to open the floor. Questions, conversation, yes.
First of all, what, I didn't know anything about this, so I thought it was on my email. So, what was did the women work there too, or just the men? And, no, the women didn't work there?
Who would like to answer that question?
That's you.
Okay. Well, did the women work there?
The women did not work there. So the deal is that the Central Mining District in southern New Mexico is comprised of a couple of mines, but primarily the Chino Mine. And the women's role was primarily to be at home and care for the families while the men went off to work. When they were essentially told that they could no longer be on strike, they were going to be arrested, they were going to lose their benefits.
The men, yeah.
It became problematic because you have to understand that the companies also owned the houses, they owned the local stores, and so they literally were in a place where they could no longer be on strike to fight for their rights. And so the women in the community stepped up and said, we would like to be an auxiliary unit for the union and go on strike for our families in our community.
Was it one specific woman? Was it a group of them that spearheaded it?
Yes.
How did it happen?
The Salt of the Earth film gives one portrayal of how that happened, okay? Because the script writers came in and took the narrative and wanted to represent the story, okay? So according to the film, the women organized, they wanted their own auxiliary, and they stood up to the men who did not want them in a leadership role and took to the picket line anyway. But as we started to learn behind the scenes from folks that came just to tell us their stories, and by the way, we situated ourselves at libraries and museums. We got the word out, and everyone had an equal opportunity to come. They had it posted in the post office or the Bayard City Council. So we didn't really know who to ask. People had to come to us. They self-selected. And among those people who self-elected came and told us, behind the scenes, the women had been mobilizing all along. They just hadn't been vocal. So when they had a moment of exigence like this injunction placed on them by the law enforcement of Silver City, that the men could no longer strike and they wanted to shut down the strike, the women were already poised for action. Virginia Chaconne was a strong leader in that movement. She was pregnant at this time, and her son is the one who relayed that story to us. And he came with pictures of his parents and said, my mom was pregnant. She didn't walk this picket line, but she was mobilizing all along with the women. They had been educating and building consciousness about labor and about their roles as leaders even before the strike had happened. So it was kind of a synergy going on. So when they stepped up, they had a real strong consciousness about their leadership role and their potential. Yeah.
As strikers, did they block access to the mine?
That's really interesting. So now you get another expert or another person who was present. This is Terry Humble, the local historian who was a small child, about 8 years old. His father belonged to the local 890 union, but he was one of the few Anglo families in the community. He did not work in that mine. He had a lease to another mine which required going over the bridge by the strikers. So they sympathized, his father sympathized with the strikers, and from his reports, they did not block the bridge. They were just rotating around, and business was possible to continue. To Santa Rita, it did not block it, no. the bridge is offset from Santa Rita. So I don't know why the Hanover Bridge was the site, other than it was probably a thoroughfare to access back and forth and bring materials up and
So
down.
I'm unclear on what the strike did, if it didn't block access to the mine.
I believe it was a demonstration that encouraged scabs or discouraged scabs from stepping across the line. And it was effective enough because the workers who were down in the pit mines doing the most dangerous jobs were the Mexicano laborers. And so they basically shut the operation down because of the solidarity. And then the women stepped up when the injunction came. So from the pieces that we get, and that is the puzzling thing, is nobody really has the whole strand of the story. You cannot find a history. You have a film, you've got fragments, you've got newspaper articles, and you have the witnesses who are actually there because of, over time, they're passing away and the stories are being lost. So they wanted those stories recovered and brought out. Yeah, there was another question in the back.
Just a question and a comment. Just to clarify, was the strike focused on the Santa Rita mine or the Hanover mine?
Would you like to take that, Zachary?
It was the Chino Mine,
Okay.
correct? Yeah.
Chino Mine, yes.
Is the Chino Mine. And the Chino Mine is in Santa Rita. It's gone by a couple of different names. It's gone by the Santa Rita del Cobre, and it's gone by the Chino Mine. But is not the Hanover Mine, which is actually newer, isn't it?
I believe so.
Yeah, so the Hanover Mine is actually quite contemporary in comparison to the Chino Mine.
And then the Fierro Mine, which is...
And it is also not the Fierro Mine, which is a little further down the road. Yeah.
Thank you.
And if you'd like to actually go and see it, we actually have put on a digital map where you can find that bridge, because you don't have to ask everybody in town where it is now. We're showing you how to get there. And Terry Humboldt has a historic tour of all the mining district every second Tuesday of every month. Is that correct? Anyway, you can actually go and see these. Okay.
Thank you. I've got a lot of family history.
Okay, you got a lot of
with
family.
mine and the area. But the other comment is this morning when I announced to the world that I was going to come to this lecture, I drew fire from a guy who said that his father helped him negotiate the settlement, and he sort of painted it as this very benign thing, and he initially denied that any women were incarcerated, and he said, check your history. So of course I Googled and found a newspaper article that talked about the women who were incarcerated, and that kind of calmed him down. But then he kind of softened, and he said, well, my mom, his mom, actually went out on the picket line in solidarity with the other women in the community and almost caused a divorce in the family. Because the dad was working for the mine administrators,
Yep.
and the mom was out there on the line. And
Wow.
that made an interesting dinner time conversation.
Well, that is, okay, so another little strand of the story that came to us by witnesses was what you said in terms of women who did choose to have solidarity with the women on the picket lines. There was the management, which is largely Anglo, and they generally belonged to the Catholic Church, Our Lady of Fatima, which was helped built by Thomas Foy, Irish Catholic family, Anglo family there that were in the kind of the political structure of the community. The wives and women of those managerial type structure families did not generally show solidarity. So your story is pretty interesting. For those that did, now I do have it also in some reports that the local Madam Millie, she and her ladies did show solidarity. They brought food, they brought clothing, and they helped the women. They held babies. So the ladies of Madam Millie's house of business was very active. Now there was another layer of this. There's kind of in terms of who shows solidarity and who doesn't. The fact that Vicente Ximenes and the American GI Forum did, from Albuquerque, help set up chapters and bring food and clothing was significant because the Catholic Church restricted parishes from providing solidarity because they thought this is a communist sympathizing event. So the American GI Forum, Ximenes, Madam Millie, and some people crossed that restriction and it did show solidarity. Yeah.
I think there was that problem with scams because nobody else wanted to do that kind of work. And another thing that I've read over the years, I do have a copy of the film, is that I think Juan Chaconne played himself, did he not? And the actress from Mexico who played his wife,
Rosada.
yes, Rosada, was
Rosada.
blacklisted, and it ruined her career.
She was blacklisted. They had not finished the filming, and she could not cross the border. They wouldn't let her finish the filming. They had to finish the filming over the border.
So was the film made at the same time?
No. Does you want to answer that?
So right after the strike happened, the film was like 2 years after. So that's why you have people like Willie, the gentleman that we kept quoting, and you can see his picture on the slideshow. He was a child in the strike, and he was a child in the movie. So it's very strange relationship between the movie and the strike, because going back to this gentleman's question about like check your history. Where would we go to check that history, right? Because it's not a simple Google search. And even if you did wander into an archive to look for this stuff, there's not a whole lot, right? Because like Michelle was saying, like the voices of the women, they have chosen not to speak, right? They have chosen not to speak a lot of the time. And so what made this project so special was that it kind of like got everyone together to write their own stories. Not anyone take it, right? They wrote their own stories and we put it in a public sphere. And so now we can check our history. But to answer your question, the movie was made shortly after the strike finished. And so the strike and the movie got really close to each other. They almost became the same thing.
I haven't seen the movie, so is it produced like a documentary or is it more like a drama?
It's like a drama.
Oh yeah, it's very much. I would say it's very much in the realm of documentary. Yeah, I'm actually using it as a documentary piece for a class that I'm teaching, and just visually, we're trying to understand exactly, in terms of like the way it's shot, and how the narrative structure, the perspective of the film, and what exactly makes it or qualifies it as a documentary. But I would argue that yes, it was more rooted in documentary, but it gets confusing because of the fact that it was so closely linked to actual events. Yeah.
And you had a comment about Juan Chaconne playing himself. Well, here's, a little bit of the strangeness of that. Juan Chaconne didn't actually participate in the strike. So he plays himself in the film, but he didn't participate in the strike. He and Virginia his wife Virginia Chaconne were really active and very educated in terms of labor rights and really at the forefront of mobilizing. But Virginia was pregnant with John J. Chaconne Jr. And so they opted not to be on the strike line, although they were supporting it all along. So he plays himself as an active member of the strike, but he in person was not actually on the strike line. Neither was Virginia. So these little intricacies of who was there, who wasn't, becomes kind of, as Zachary said, a little confusing. So the fiction becomes the fact. So, yeah.
Do we have time for one more question? Anybody or comments?
Yes, please, and then.
I think it's wonderful that we're documenting this because I was here at that time and I didn't have any idea what was going on. But my husband did join the GI Forum, but I don't remember exactly what they were doing.
What year did your husband join the GI Forum? Was in the 50s?
50s.
Wow, so it was just when they established the first. And the first chapter of the American GI Forum was here in Barrelos. So at the Sacred Heart, yeah, right here.
I went to some of the GI Forum.
Oh my goodness, right.
But my memory has erased what
Amazing.
Unfortunately, so I'm so happy that you're doing this.
And I'm so happy you're here. That's wonderful. And you had a question or a comment? Or?
Yeah, I'm confused about logistics.
Oh, so am I.
As the women were on the picket line, where were the male employees? Were they going to work? So as
No, they
to
were
lose
not.
their jobs?
No, and that's a really good question. And Rachel Valencia's narrative that I read says the men were overseeing, and it was a little vague what she meant by that. The men who were overseeing were the men, husbands, brothers, fathers, who were not working, but were off to the side. They were restricted from getting on the picket line by threat of arrest. But they were watching.
Absent from their work.
But they're absent from the work and watching.
I saw as I was Googling, I saw a YouTube video of I believe it was a gentleman interviewing his own mother about that. And
I'd love to see that.
It pops right up. It's great. And she's having a hard time speaking, but her story is very compelling. And one thing that she says is that, I believe it was in this video, that somebody was, like a woman in her, very elderly, was knocked down by a car that was charging through, and that was then shot in the leg.
Yes.
Or a man who tried to pull her out of the way was shot in the leg.
And that's what Rachel corroborates that story.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, last one.
Is there any reason that women couldn't have been prohibited from striking the way the men?
They weren't laborers. Right. So the labor no strike clause restricted the men, and the local law enforcement officials then saw fit to arrest anyone that violated the men. So they were not, as laborers, restricted from anything. They were exercising civil rights. There's no reason for them to be arrested. Disturbing civil rights. They were,
And they weren't blocking access to the mines.
So there was no reason for them to be arrested, other than they were holding up, in terms of the solidarity, the productivity of the mine. I'd like to acknowledge one person who's here, who's been with us from the very beginning. I'm going to let you introduce him.
Oh, okay. I quoted Isaiah Solis. There he is. He was my student. I teach composition at UNM. And I just happened to mention that we were going to be in Bayard. And he heard me say the word Bayard. And he's like, what's going on in Bayard? Because I'm from there. And he came out and he really showed his support, not only at our dry run workshop that we did at University of New Mexico in preparation, but he also showed up in Bayard and Silver City to really show his support and solidarity with our project. And now here he is again. So we'd like to thank him for coming. Yeah, absolutely.